In the quiet heart of New England, beneath the brittle autumn skies of 1895, there was a place no one dared speak of aloud, a place swallowed by shadows, where the laughter of children turned into whispers of dread. This was the St. Marguerite Orphanage, a fortress of sorrow perched on the edge of a forgotten forest. Every full moon, without fail, a child vanished, disappeared as if swallowed by the night itself. Not one soul ever returned to tell what happened. But the truth, buried deep beneath layers of deceit and silence, is far darker than any local legend. What if I told you this orphanage was not just a home for lost children, but a deliberate front, a sinister cog in a greater machine designed to feed a hidden agenda? What if the innocent faces that smiled in daylight hid the cruelest secrets, secrets that those in power desperately wanted buried? This is no mere ghost story. This is a tale of systemic corruption, of a psychological prison disguised as charity, and of the mechanisms of control so profound they still echo today. You were never meant to learn what happened here. The truth is a weapon, one carefully guarded by those who manipulate history and memory alike. But now that weapon is in your hands, and once you begin, you cannot turn away. The deeper you descend, the more you'll realize that some disappearances are not accidents, but carefully orchestrated rituals of power designed to maintain control far beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. Look closely and you'll see how institutions meant to protect can become instruments of psychological imprisonment and moral decay. St. Marguerite was no exception. It was a crucible where innocence was extinguished to fuel a hidden economy of silence and obedience. The children who vanished are not just missing, they were erased, sacrificed to sustain a legacy of fear and obedience. Prepare yourself. This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is the first step into a world where the line between protector and predator blurs, and where the darkest forces of human nature reign unseen. The moon rises again, and with it the unspoken horrors of St. Marguerite awaken. Let me take you inside. To understand the shadows cast by St. Marguerite, you must first grasp the power of silence, the kind that binds communities in complicit blindness. In 1895, New England was a land still grappling with rapid industrial change, social unrest, and the lingering scars of a brutal civil war. Orphanages were not just shelters. They were institutions where society's most vulnerable were hidden away, forgotten or discarded. Yet, beneath the veneer of charity, these places were breeding grounds for control, an unspoken contract between those who ruled and those who obeyed. St. Marguerite was no ordinary orphanage. Its founder, a wealthy industrialist named Elias Thornfield, was a man of many faces. Publicly, a philanthropist dedicated to saving lost children. Privately, a figure entwined with the darkest corridors of power, secret societies, political puppeteering, and occult symbolism woven into the very foundation of his empire. Thornfield's vision for the orphanage was not mercy, but mastery. Every full moon, Thornfield's associates would conduct clandestine gatherings on the estate, masked by the routine of care. The children were never simply disappearing, they were being selected, taken for reasons buried in ritual, experimentation, and psychological manipulation. The full moon was not a coincidence but a signal, a temporal key unlocking the doors to hidden chambers beneath the orphanage, where the invisible hand of control was at work. The victims, children with no voice, became pawns in a chilling experiment of obedience and submission. Some say it was to test endurance against terror. Others whisper of arcane ceremonies meant to harness forbidden energies. What is certain is that these disappearances served to instill a pervasive fear, a lesson to all who remained. Obedience was survival, resistance meant erasure. But why would such darkness persist under the guise of and safe care? Because those who wield true power understand that control begins with the innocent, the untarnished souls who can be shaped, broken, or erased without public scrutiny. The orphanage was a crucible for the construction of compliance, and every vanished child was a ghost stamped into the ledger of this hidden economy. Remember this, beneath every act of benevolence can lie a web of corruption. This is the pattern you must learn to see. Beneath the orphanage's ivy-clad walls, the ground hid secrets far older than the brick and mortar above. Long before Thornfield's time, the land was sacred to local indigenous tribes, a place believed to be a portal between worlds, a thin veil separating the living from the restless dead. When Thornfield claimed the property, he did so with the knowledge that power is often tied to place. To the untrained eye, it was just an abandoned estate. To him, it was a gateway. This was no accident. In the cellars beneath St. Marguerite, hidden behind false walls and locked doors, archaic symbols adorned the damp stone. The architecture itself became a tool, a labyrinth designed to disorient and break down those who wandered its depths. The children, terrified and confused, were led deeper into this maze during each disappearance, drawn into rituals shrouded in darkness and whispered incantations. Psychological control was as real as the chains that bound them. Fear was weaponized, each full moon a psychological reset, a brutal reminder of who held power. Those who resisted were made examples of, their absence a silent warning carved into the memories of the remaining children. The very fabric of their reality was manipulated until their minds fractured, their identities reshaped to fit the narrative imposed upon them. This is the essence of institutional manipulation, breaking down the individual will to forge obedient vessels. The orphanage was a stage on which a far greater drama unfolded, one where corruption and occult forces blended, feeding on the anguish of lost innocence to sustain a hidden hierarchy. This story is not just about vanished children, it's about the mechanisms that allow such horrors to persist unseen, the systemic rot buried beneath the facade of civilization. When the world demands silence, the shadows grow longer and the truth becomes a dangerous whisper carried on the wind. You're now walking the edge of that abyss. The next revelations will challenge everything you thought you knew about trust, power, and control. The disappearance of children at St. Marguerite was not random chaos. It was a meticulously engineered cycle, coded into the very operation of the orphanage. Each full moon marked a ritualistic purge, a culling to maintain the fragile equilibrium of power Thornfield and his secretive council maintained. They were not merely removing bodies. They were erasing witnesses, silencing potential threats before they could speak truths too dangerous for the public. The orphans left behind were taught to internalize fear as obedience. Their days were regimented with harsh discipline, their nights haunted by the ever-present knowledge that the moon's rise could mean their own vanishing. In this crucible, trust died, replaced by suspicion and learned helplessness. This psychological torment was no accident but an intentional tool, a dark science designed to create perfect compliance through terror. Within the orphanage's walls, staff members were complicit actors in this theater of control. Many were themselves victims, trapped in cycles of abuse, bribery, and blackmail. Others were willing participants, drawn by promises of power or caught in the gravitational pull of the occult network Thornfield commanded. The layers of complicity ran deep, creating a system self-sustaining and nearly impossible to dismantle. Outside the orphanage, rumors whispered but never reached ears willing to listen. Town officials, law enforcement, and clergy all turned blind eyes, their silence bought or coerced. This collective denial was a key pillar of the hidden agenda. By suppressing investigation and discourse, the shadow network ensured the machine of fear and control continued to grind undisturbed. You must understand this. Institutional manipulation thrives on complicity and silence. It weaves a web so dense that escaping its grip requires not just courage, but awakening. The vanished children of St. Marguerite are more than lost souls. They are symbols of a broken system, and their story is a call to see beyond the veil of lies. If you're ready to dive deeper, prepare yourself for the truth you'll have to carry, and carry with purpose. The cycle of disappearance was only the beginning. What followed beneath the orphanage's stone floors was a grim choreography of power that defied the laws of man and nature. Behind hidden doors in cryptic chambers, the children were subjected to unthinkable rituals that blended archaic magic with early experiments in psychological control and manipulation. These ceremonies were designed to fracture the boundaries of the human mind, pushing the limits of fear, obedience, and suggestion. The goal was not merely to break the children physically, but to unmake their identities, to erase their pasts and rebuild them as tools for a larger, more sinister purpose. Thornfield's operation was not just about control of bodies, but mastery over the soul. Whispers from survivors, rare and heavily suppressed, tell of voices in the darkness calling names that weren't their own, of visions implanted deep within fractured memories. The full moon's light was a trigger, a cosmic signal that awakened dormant conditioning planted like a virus within their minds. Each disappearance wasn't a loss, but an initiation, a transformation into something beyond ordinary understanding. This was the blueprint for psychological enslavement, a system that predated modern techniques but anticipated them with uncanny precision. The children's minds became battlegrounds, territories where forbidden knowledge was weaponized to bind, control, and erase. And those who emerged from these depths, if they emerged at all, were changed forever. Hollowed-out vessels carrying shadows instead of light, walking reminders of the monstrous power hidden behind civility's mask. The real horror lies not just in what happened to these children, but in the legacy they left, a legacy encoded in institutions and systems still thriving today. The orphanage was a crucible where innocence was melted down to forge the tools of obedience, submission, and silent control. Remember this well, the past is not dead. It pulses beneath the surface, shaping the present in ways most refuse to see. By 1895, St. Marguerite had become a fortress of ritualized terror, its walls soaked in secrets and whispers that never reached the outside world. Every child who vanished left behind an imprint of fear so deep it reshaped the surviving children's very perception of reality. The orphanage was not just a building, it was a living mechanism of manipulation designed to twist innocence into a commodity, fear into currency. Elias Thornfield understood something most never grasp. Power is not maintained through force alone, but through control over the mind. The children who remained learned quickly that reality was negotiable. They were taught to doubt their senses, to question the truth, to mistrust the most basic instincts. In such a state, obedience became instinctive, survival a constant negotiation with unseen forces. And Thornfield's ambitions did not end with the orphanage. He was tied to a network of wealthy elites and secret societies, men and women who believed in the occult as a tool of governance. The disappearances were a ritualistic thread linking the orphanage to this larger tapestry of control, a pattern designed to condition future generations, to prepare the soil for ideas and practices that would remain invisible to the masses. The children were, in essence, experimental agents, human test subjects for techniques of domination that would ripple outward into society. Some were released, marked forever with psychological scars that made them pliable, loyal to authority, and deeply afraid of independence. Others were lost entirely, erased to feed the machinery of secrecy. Outside the orphanage, townspeople speculated in hushed tones, their imaginations attempting to fill gaps the mind could barely bear to imagine. Stories of hauntings, curses, and vengeful spirits circulated, but they never scratched the surface of the reality. The real terror was invisible, systematic and entirely human, hidden in plain sight, cloaked beneath charity, obedience, and the false promise of safety. You must see it now. Control is rarely about chains. It is about shaping perception, rewriting memory, and instilling doubt so deep it becomes indistinguishable from truth. And the children of St. Marguerite were its first and most tragic experiment. The full moon was both signal and executioner. As its cold light spilled across the orphanage's grounds, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Children whispered prayers that went unheard, hearts pounding with the unnameable dread of the night ahead. They knew the pattern, the rhythm of disappearance. Fear had become their constant companion, a shadow stitched to every heartbeat. Behind the orphanage's walls, hidden mechanisms ensured no one could escape. Secret staircases led to subterranean chambers, concealed passages to rooms whose purposes were never explained. These spaces were meticulously designed to disorient, to fracture perception, to break down even the strongest of wills. A child's sense of time warped, days and nights blurred, reality became a labyrinth and sanity a tenuous thread. Those taken were not simply removed, they were transformed. Stories speak of dark rituals, chants in languages long forgotten, symbols carved into flesh and stone, all intended to manipulate the mind and bind the spirit. The moonlight was more than illumination. It was a trigger, a key to ancient forces Thornfield and his council believed they could command. The children became vessels for something larger than human comprehension, conduits for control extending far beyond the orphanage. The survivors carried the trauma outward, unknowingly spreading the imprint of manipulation. Each step they took into the world was a test of the systems instilled within them, the rules of fear, obedience, and learned helplessness. Thornfield's work was a blueprint, a model for shaping minds with precision and terror, an art form disguised as cruelty. And yet the community at large remained ignorant. Officials, clergy, and neighbors saw only the surface. A charitable orphanage, children playing in the courtyard, the serene rhythm of rural life. But underneath, a dark symphony played, its notes of suffering and control orchestrated with chilling clarity. The orphanage had become a nexus, a hub of clandestine power that manipulated not just the children, but the perception of reality itself. Understand this: the horrors of St. Marguerite are not relics of the past. They are a blueprint for control, a lesson in the mechanisms of fear, obedience, and manipulation that can extend far beyond the walls of any single institution. By the mid-1890s, the orphanage had gained a reputation that even the bravest dared not speak aloud. Rumors whispered through the towns surrounding St. Marguerite were dark, fragmented, frightening enough to unsettle the imagination, yet vague enough that no one could point directly to the truth. The disappearances were always blamed on accidents, illness, or the children running away. But those who looked closely, who dared to notice patterns, glimpsed the unthinkable. These vanishings were deliberate, calculated, and ritualistic. Elias Thornfield's methods were chilling in their precision. Each child selected for disappearance was not chosen at random. There was a pattern, an intention rooted in attributes Thornfield valued for his experiments: innocence, fear response, compliance under pressure, and sometimes raw defiance. He observed, recorded, and adjusted. Each full moon, the orphanage became both a laboratory and a stage for the enactment of power that few could comprehend. The psychological impact on those left behind was devastating. Fear became a learned reflex, obedience a survival mechanism, and trust a dangerous illusion. Those who dared defy the system were marked by absence, their silence echoing through the hallways as a warning. Thornfield's orchestration of terror extended beyond physical removal. He rewired minds, leaving indelible marks of trauma that would persist long after the moon waned. And while the children were the primary victims, the network surrounding Thornfield, the staff, the clergy, the silent observers, were complicit in ways both conscious and unconscious. Some sought personal gain, others feared exposure, and many were bound by the subtle coercion of secrecy. This web of complicity ensured that the orphanage operated without interference, hidden behind layers of trust, reputation, and societal indifference. It is crucial to understand. St. Marguerite was never about charity. It was about control, experimentation, and the cultivation of fear. Every disappearance, every ritual, every whispered threat served to reinforce a system that reached far beyond the walls of the orphanage, and the power it wielded was not simply physical, it was psychological, pervasive, and hauntingly effective. Now, pay attention. As we descend deeper, you will see not just the horrors of the past, but the blueprint of influence that resonates even in today's world. By this point, the town's perception of St. Marguerite had become a fragile illusion. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary, a place of hope, of charity, of safety for the unwanted and the orphaned. Yet inside, the walls told a different story. Every echo in the hallways, every whispered cry, was a testament to the orchestrated terror that had become routine. The children lived in a perpetual state of anticipation, never knowing which night would bring the next full moon and the inevitable disappearance. The architecture of fear was deliberate. Rooms were arranged to disorient, corridors twisted to confuse, and locked doors created the illusion of escape without ever offering it. Thornfield understood that the human mind can be as malleable as clay in the hands of someone who knows the rules. His methods were not just about physical restraint, they were about shaping perception, conditioning fear, and controlling belief. He used the staff as instruments of this system. Some were coerced, others seduced by the promise of power or wealth, and all were complicit in reinforcing the cycle of obedience. Every action, every punishment, every whispered warning served to teach the children a single lesson: resistance leads to erasure. The full moon became a symbol of inevitability, a cosmic reminder that forces beyond their understanding dictated their fates. And yet, the most terrifying aspect was how ordinary it all seemed. From the outside, St. Marguerite appeared mundane, even benevolent. The evil was hidden, not in spectacle, but in subtlety, an invisible hand guiding every interaction, every routine, every heartbeat. This is the hallmark of systemic manipulation. The true danger lies not in what is obvious, but in what is unseen. If you are paying attention, you must see the pattern. Control, fear, obedience, these were not incidental. They were the very purpose of the orphanage. The vanished children were not merely victims. They were instruments in a grander design, a testament to the lengths those in power will go to maintain dominance. Halfway now. Type "The Moon Watches All" twice in the comments to anchor this revelation and lock in awareness of the forces at play. Beneath the orphanage, in the damp, stone-lined corridors of the hidden cellars, the disappearances took on a ritualistic rhythm that few outsiders could imagine. Here, the children were not simply hidden, they were transformed. The full moon's light, filtered through narrow openings, acted as a signal, activating processes that blurred the lines between fear, obedience, and indoctrination. Every step they took in those subterranean chambers was a step deeper into a system designed to rewrite their very minds. The rituals were a fusion of archaic practices and early psychological experimentation. Symbols etched into the walls, chants whispered in languages no longer spoken, and the strategic use of light, shadow, and sound combined to manipulate perception. Some children spoke later of voices that echoed from nowhere, naming them differently, reshaping identity and instilling the sense that reality itself was pliable. Thornfield and his council believed they were uncovering the edges of human potential and controlling it. The staff, trained and conditioned themselves, reinforced these practices. Fear became a language, and every interaction, punishment, and reward was carefully calculated to mold behavior. The remaining children learned to navigate a landscape where reality was never stable, trust was a danger, and compliance equated to survival. This orchestration of terror was so precise that it was nearly invisible to outsiders, a masterclass in psychological control disguised as care. Yet even within this darkness, patterns emerged. Those who resisted, who questioned the world imposed upon them, were removed during the full moon, taken to the hidden chambers and never returned. Those who adapted survived, carrying with them a fractured identity that served the interests of the orphanage's hidden network. Through this relentless cycle, Thornfield maintained an invisible empire of fear, a system where power was not taken. It was instilled, enforced, and internalized. Understand this: the horrors of St. Marguerite are not relics of a distant past. They are lessons in human manipulation, in the subtle and terrifying power that institutions can wield when obedience is enforced through fear, secrecy, and ritual. These truths, hidden in plain sight, reveal the mechanisms of control that endure far beyond the orphanage's walls. By now, the orphanage's hidden mechanisms had created a psychological landscape as treacherous as any physical trap. Every child who remained learned to navigate a world where trust was fatal and fear was survival. The full moon became a metronome, marking time in cycles of terror that left no room for hope. Each disappearance reinforced a lesson. The world is controlled by forces invisible, unyielding, and merciless. Thornfield's obsession was not merely with obedience, it was with transformation. He sought to create vessels capable of extreme compliance, yet adaptable under pressure. The children were conditioned to fear, to doubt, to obey instinctively. Their identities, once free and fluid, were molded into shadows of what society demanded: compliant, silent, and invisible. The psychological impact was far deeper than anyone outside could imagine. Staff members became instruments of his design. They executed routines meticulously, ensuring every detail reinforced fear and compliance. Any deviation, any hint of empathy, was punished subtly but effectively, another lesson encoded into the children's psyche. Complicity was built into the very framework of the orphanage. No one could resist without risking erasure. Beyond the walls, the community remained blind. Parents, clergy, and officials were either too afraid or too willing to ignore the pattern. This enforced silence was crucial. Power thrives where oversight is absent, where questioning is suppressed. St. Marguerite's horrors existed not just because of Thornfield, but because society allowed them to persist. Now, as we descend further, understand this. The orphanage was more than a site of suffering. It was a blueprint of control, a model for shaping human behavior through fear, ritual, and manipulation. The vanished children were never random victims. They were carefully selected agents in a system designed to study, condition, and exploit. Their story is a warning. The machinery of influence often hides behind the guise of benevolence. Brace yourself. The deeper truths are darker, and the forces at play are far more intricate than simple cruelty. We are only beginning to see the architecture of manipulation in its full, terrifying form. The orphanage's influence extended far beyond its walls. Thornfield understood something most cannot grasp. True power is invisible. It operates not through brute force alone, but through shaping thought, perception, and belief. Every child who survived a full moon became a living testament to his methods, scarred, compliant, and unknowingly carrying the imprint of control into the world. These children were observed constantly. Every gesture, every expression, every whispered word was noted, recorded, and analyzed. Thornfield's council maintained meticulous logs, detailing responses to fear, obedience under pressure, and susceptibility to suggestion. This was not merely cruelty, it was a dark science, one that blurred the lines between psychology, ritual, and coercion. Each disappearance, each selection, was a data point in a larger experiment designed to uncover the limits of human malleability. But the power of St. Marguerite was subtle, almost invisible to those outside. From the outside it appeared a charitable institution, a safe haven for children society had abandoned. Few questioned the patterns because fear and secrecy were reinforced at every level, by staff, by neighbors, by the community's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The orphanage thrived precisely because its evil was hidden in plain sight. The moon continued its relentless cycle, a celestial clock dictating the rhythm of terror. The children learned the lessons instinctively. Compliance equaled survival. Resistance meant disappearance. Trust was a dangerous illusion, empathy a liability. In this crucible, identity itself became malleable, reshaped under the weight of fear and authority. And yet the true horror of St. Marguerite lies not in the physical acts of disappearance, but in the legacy of control it left behind, a blueprint for domination that extends into society at large. The children who survived carried with them a conditioned response to authority, an internalized obedience that served the hidden agenda long after the orphanage's doors closed. Now prepare yourself. We are about to confront the mechanisms of terror in their purest form, and the truths you're about to hear will challenge your understanding of control, fear, and power. In the hidden chambers beneath St. Marguerite, time itself seemed to bend. Days and nights lost meaning, replaced by cycles dictated by ritual, fear, and the ever-present gaze of Thornfield's agents. The children were immersed in an environment where perception was constantly manipulated, where shadows whispered, sounds were distorted, and the line between reality and illusion blurred. Each full moon intensified this, amplifying their terror and, paradoxically, their obedience. Thornfield's methods were meticulous. Fear was calibrated, measured, and applied with precision. The children were not simply punished, they were taught to anticipate punishment, to internalize authority so deeply that resistance became unthinkable. Compliance was not just rewarded, It was reinforced neurologically, psychologically, even spiritually, through ceremonies designed to embed obedience into the very fabric of their being. The walls themselves became instruments. Hidden passageways, locked doors, and labyrinthine corridors created disorientation. Echoes of whispers and footsteps, strategically amplified, made the children feel constantly observed. Every act, every reaction, every misstep was recorded. The full moon acted as a temporal trigger, synchronizing the rituals of erasure with the cycles of nature, a method of conditioning that extended beyond ordinary comprehension. Even those who managed to resist in small ways were not truly free. Thornfield understood the power of subtlety, leaving just enough hope to perpetuate obedience, just enough fear to prevent rebellion. The surviving children carried the lessons outward, unknowingly perpetuating the hidden agenda. Their minds, reshaped by fear and ritual, became vessels for a system designed to dominate beyond the orphanage itself. And the town? They remained blind, complicit in their ignorance. Parents, neighbors, and clergy say only what was presented, a charitable institution caring for abandoned children. Few questioned the pattern of vanishings, and those who did were quietly silenced, their concerns dismissed, buried beneath layers of rationalization and social expectation. Understand this: the horror of St. Marguerite is not confined to the past. It is a blueprint, a lesson in the architecture of fear, obedience, and control. And as we descend further, you will see not just the tactics, but the philosophy behind them, the blueprint of domination perfected over decades in darkness. By 1895, the orphanage had become a nexus of unseen power, its influence extending far beyond the estate's ivy-clad walls. Every vanished child was not merely a victim, but a calculated part of a larger design, an experiment in obedience, fear, and the control of human will. Thornfield's vision was not limited to the orphanage itself. It was a blueprint for shaping society, one mind at a time, through hidden systems of influence. The rituals performed beneath the orphanage were designed to fracture identity and reconstruct it according to a hidden template. Symbols etched into walls, chants repeated in languages long forgotten, and orchestrated psychological pressure combined to create a state of pliability. Children emerged changed, some so compliant that questioning authority became impossible, others hollowed out, carrying the imprint of control like an invisible brand. Staff, carefully selected or coerced, were complicit in these mechanisms. Every punishment, every reward, every whispered command was calibrated to reinforce the system. Even acts that appeared benevolent were tactical. They reinforced obedience, demonstrated authority, and perpetuated fear. Complicity was not just a matter of choice, it was a condition imposed by the design of the orphanage itself. Outside, the town remained unaware. Officials, clergy, and neighbors all turned blind eyes, either out of ignorance, fear, or social expedience. The disappearances were dismissed, rationalized, buried beneath the veneer of charity. But this silence was essential. The orphanage's power relied on invisibility, on maintaining the illusion that nothing sinister occurred within its walls. The full moon's cycle remained the key. It dictated the timing of disappearances, synchronizing the ritualistic and psychological machinery that Thornfield had constructed. Each child taken served as both subject and lesson, a warning to the survivors, a demonstration of power to the silent observers, and a reinforcement of the hidden hierarchy orchestrated by those in control. Now, pay attention. The architecture of fear you see here is not merely historical, it is a lesson in the mechanisms of influence that persist to this day. The next revelations will take us deeper into the machinery of control, where power and manipulation intersect in ways you were never meant to understand. The hidden chambers beneath St. Marguerite were more than just physical spaces, they were crucibles of transformation. Each child brought into these subterranean halls experienced a systematic breakdown of identity. The methods were precise: sensory deprivation, orchestrated confusion, and the strategic use of fear to dissolve the boundaries between self and imposed authority. The full moon amplified these effects, acting as both trigger and ritual catalyst. What emerged from these depths was a testament to Thornfield's mastery of psychological control. Some children were molded into compliant instruments, their thoughts and reactions predictably obedient. Others, broken beyond recognition, carried with them the echoes of trauma, a silent warning to those who remained above ground. Every disappearance reinforced a cycle of control, a lesson etched into the psyche of both the taken and the witnesses. Staff members acted as extensions of this system. Their presence was not merely supervision, it was reinforcement of a hierarchy that thrived on fear and invisibility. Every punishment, every reward, every subtle manipulation served to embed obedience deeper into the children's minds. Complicity was mandatory, and deviation was met with consequences carefully designed to ensure compliance. Outside the orphanage, society remained blind to the orchestration. The facade of benevolence was meticulously maintained. Children playing in courtyards, charitable donations, and public ceremonies all reinforced a narrative of care. The machinery of terror operated in plain sight, hidden beneath layers of trust, expectation, and the unwillingness of outsiders to confront what they could barely comprehend. This is the essential lesson of St. Marguerite. True control is not always overt. It is subtle, invisible, and systemic. Fear is not merely applied, it is internalized, transformed it into instinct, shaping behavior in ways both immediate and long-lasting. The orphanage was more than a site of horror. It was a laboratory for domination, a model for the hidden mechanisms of influence that persist in institutions even today. Prepare yourself. The next sections will reveal how these mechanisms of control reached beyond the orphanage, touching lives and shaping reality in ways most cannot perceive. By this stage, it becomes clear that St. Marguerite was not merely an isolated site of cruelty. It was part of a larger system, a network of influence and control extending far beyond New England. Thornfield's ambitions reached into society itself, using the orphanage as both a laboratory and a signal. Each vanished child, each survivor molded by fear, became a thread in a web that intertwined power, secrecy, and obedience. The full moon served as a metronome for this operation. Its rise activated the rituals, synchronized the disappearances, and reinforced the psychological architecture carefully constructed over years. Children who survived were conditioned not only to obey but to perpetuate the system themselves, carrying lessons of fear, hierarchy, and hidden power into the world beyond the orphanage walls. The methods employed were subtle yet devastating. Sensory manipulation, enforced isolation, and ritualized terror combined to fracture identity and reshape perception. Thornfield and his council observed, recorded, and adjusted, refining techniques that targeted not just behavior, but belief. Reality itself became a malleable tool, reshaped according to the needs of those in power. Even the community surrounding the orphanage played a role, often unknowingly. Clergy, officials, and neighbors either ignored the patterns or rationalized them, allowing the system to persist unchallenged. Complicity, whether born of fear, convenience, or ignorance, ensured the machinery of St. Marguerite functioned uninterrupted. Silence became a weapon, and those who sought answers found themselves marginalized or erased. Now, understand this. The orphanage was more than a site of past horrors. It was a blueprint for domination, demonstrating how fear, ritual, and systemic control can be combined to shape not only individuals, but entire communities. The lessons embedded within T's history resonate far beyond its walls. They are a warning and a guide for those who wish to perceive the mechanisms of influence that operate invisibly in our world today. The survivors of St. Marguerite carried more than memories. They carried patterns of fear, obedience, and silent submission encoded into the psyche like a hidden language. Each full moon had drilled lessons into their minds. Trust is dangerous, authority is absolute, and resistance is erased. These lessons did not vanish with childhood. They propagated, shaping behavior and perception long into adulthood. Thornfield's methods were designed to outlast him. By breaking and reshaping the children, he created agents of influence who would unknowingly enforce the system in other arenas of life. Fear had become internalized, self-policing, a mechanism of control that no longer required overt supervision. This was the true genius of his design. The mind itself became a tool of domination. The network surrounding St. Marguerite ensured the perpetuation of this influence. Staff, alumni, and silent collaborators acted in concert to maintain the illusion of benevolence, masking a deeply ingrained system of control. Outsiders rarely penetrated this facade. When they did, they were met with rationalizations, distractions, or outright denial. Society, willing or unwilling, became an accomplice in the invisible orchestration. The full moon, the cycles of disappearance, the rituals, and the psychological conditioning all were parts of a deliberate symphony, orchestrated to teach obedience, instill fear, and cultivate silent compliance. Thornfield understood what most never see. Power is most effective when it is subtle, systemic, and internalized. You are beginning to see the larger pattern. The architecture of fear and control that St. Marguerite represents is not confined to one time or place. It is a lens through which we can understand the mechanisms that allow influence, obedience, and hidden authority to persist in the world around us. Remember this: the vanished children were not merely victims, they were instruments in a system designed to propagate itself, a dark blueprint for shaping human behavior through invisible means. The architecture of St. Marguerite was not only psychological but spatial. Every corridor, every room, every hidden stairwell was engineered to manipulate perception and reinforce submission. The labyrinthine layout ensured that disorientation became instinctive. Children wandered as if in a maze, never certain which path led to safety and which led to the chambers of the vanished. Fear was embedded into the very walls, conditioning responses long before conscious thought could intervene. Thornfield understood the principle that control is most absolute when it is invisible. The external world saw a charitable orphanage. Internally, every structural choice was deliberate, a mechanism of obedience and domination. Even the outdoor spaces were calculated. Courtyards where the remaining children could glimpse the moonlight served as psychological triggers, reinforcing the cycles of terror and submission. Every element of the environment was a lesson, silently imparting the rules of the hidden system. Staff acted as extensions of this architecture. Their movements, words, and actions were choreographed to maintain a climate of controlled fear. Any deviation, whether in punishment or discipline, was a calculated adjustment to maintain the integrity of the system. Obedience was not merely encouraged, it was enforced through subtle, inescapable cues embedded into the fabric of daily life. Outside observers never saw this. The facade of benevolence was perfect. Public appearances, rituals of charity, and social connections obscured the reality of what occurred behind the walls. The power of St. Marguerite was not in spectacle but in subtlety. It was in the manipulation of perception, the calibration of fear, and the shaping of thought. Now, as we peer deeper into this system, understand that the physical maze was only one layer. The true labyrinth existed in the minds of theirs. Children carefully constructed to ensure obedience, fear, and internalized control that would persist far beyond the walls of St. Marguerite. This is the blueprint of hidden influence, the model by which institutions, both past and present, can manipulate without visible chains. By now, it becomes evident that the orphanage's true power lay not in bricks or iron, but in the invisible architecture of the mind. Thornfield and his council understood something few do. Control is most absolute when the subject believes they have no master. Each full moon, each disappearance, each whispered warning was a lesson in submission, an exercise in eroding autonomy until obedience became instinct. The children were conditioned to anticipate terror, to internalize fear as a guiding principle. Survival required compliance, and compliance required surrender, not just of actions, but of thought, perception, and will. Identity itself was manipulated, fractured, and reconstructed according to the hidden agenda. By the time some children reached adolescence, they were vessels molded by psychological precision, carrying within them the marks of a system designed to dominate without overt coercion. Staff and collaborators were integral. Many were coerced, others seduced by promises of wealth or influence, but all were complicit. Their behaviors reinforced the lessons of fear, obedience, and invisibility. The outside world never saw the orchestration. The facade of charity shielded the reality of systematic psychological domination. Silence was not merely a byproduct, it was a tool ensuring the perpetuation of control. Thornfield's ambitions extended beyond the orphanage. Each child, each survivor, was a node in a network designed to influence society itself. Fear and obedience, once internalized, became self-sustaining. The lessons learned within the walls of St. Marguerite traveled outward, shaping behaviors, perceptions, and loyalties in ways imperceptible to outsiders. Understand this: the horror of St. Marguerite is not only historical, it is a demonstration of the mechanisms by which influence, power, and control are perpetuated silently and systematically. The vanished children were never merely victims. They were instruments in a dark experiment that transcended the physical space of the orphanage, leaving a legacy of fear, obedience, and subtle domination that echoes far beyond its walls. By the time the orphanage had reached the height of its operation, its influence had become both pervasive and insidious. The remaining children moved through its halls like ghosts, their behaviors pre-programmed by cycles of fear and ritual. The full moon dictated not only disappearances, but the psychological tempo of their existence. Each light-filled night reinforced the lessons of obedience, imprinting terror so deeply that survival became synonymous with compliance. Thornfield's methods were precise and calculated. Every sound, every shadow, every gesture was orchestrated to manipulate perception. The labyrinthine corridors and hidden chambers were not merely physical constructs, they were extensions of the mind, designed to disorient, confuse, and break down any resistance. Children internalized the rules of the system so thoroughly that even absent supervision, the architecture of fear governed behavior. The surviving staff were complicit in reinforcing these lessons. They became extensions of the orphanage's psychological machinery, carrying out punishments and rewards with meticulous adherence to Thornfield's design. Even seemingly minor actions were calibrated to teach obedience, ensuring the children internalized the lessons without realizing they were being molded. The outside world remained blind. The facade of charity, care, and civility obscured the terror within. Local authorities, clergy, and neighbors either ignored the pattern or rationalized it away. Silence became an active component of the system. Society itself unwittingly perpetuated the cycle of control. This is the essential lesson. The power of St. Marguerite was not in brutality alone, but in the subtle manipulation of thought, perception, and identity. Control is most potent when internalized, when fear is accepted as a law of existence. The vanished children were not merely lost, they were the instruments through which a hidden system of domination learned to perpetuate itself, shaping minds far beyond the orphanage's walls. By now, it is impossible to ignore the sophistication of Thornfield's system. St. Marguerite functioned as a laboratory for the human psyche, where every child became a subject in an experiment in fear, obedience, and identity manipulation. The full moon's rise triggered more than disappearances. It initiated cycles of conditioning so precise that the children's minds became extensions of the orphanage itself. The rituals, whispered chants, and symbolic markings were tools to fracture the self. Fear was not merely instilled, it was engineered, measured, and reinforced until survival instinct merged seamlessly with submission. Those who resisted or questioned authority were removed, their absence a potent warning to those who remained. Compliance became instinctive. Identity, once free, was rewritten to serve the hidden agenda. Staff and collaborators acted as agents of the system, reinforcing patterns through both overt and subtle means. Punishments were calculated, rewards strategically applied, and behaviors meticulously observed. Complicity became a self-sustaining mechanism. Those who upheld the system were rewarded with status or avoidance of scrutiny, ensuring the continuity of control. Outside, the community remained oblivious. Thornfield's genius lay in invisibility. The orphanage appeared charitable, benevolent, and entirely ordinary. Yet, behind closed doors, fear and manipulation were meticulously cultivated, creating an environment where obedience was enforced not through chains, but through the internalized architecture of terror. The legacy of St. Marguerite extends beyond its walls. The surviving children, conditioned by trauma and ritual, carried patterns of obedience into the broader world. Fear became a tool for influence, shaping thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions in subtle, invisible ways. This is the true horror. The orphanage was not simply a site of disappearance, but a blueprint for domination that persists in principle, echoing in institutions and systems to this day. By this stage, the depth of Thornfield's orchestration becomes clear. St. Marguerite was more than an orphanage. It was a machine of control, designed to manipulate not only the body, but the mind itself. Each full moon acted as a pulse, a rhythm that synchronized ritual, disappearance, and psychological conditioning. Children learned to anticipate terror, internalize fear, and conform instinctively to the rules of a system they barely understood. The rituals were precise and symbolic, combining early psychological experimentation with archaic, almost occult practices. Sounds, shadows, and spatial manipulation fractured perception. Names, identities, and memories were subtly rewritten. By the time some children reached adolescence, obedience was so deeply ingrained that resistance became unthinkable, even unimaginable. The mind itself became the instrument of control. Staff members, trained or coerced, were integral. Their actions reinforced lessons of fear and compliance, ensuring that deviation was not tolerated. Even the smallest acts, tone of voice, gaze, timing, were calibrated to maintain dominance over the children's perception and behavior. Each action was a node in the network of influence that Thornfield had constructed. Outside observers saw only charity, civility, and care. The facade was perfect. Townspeople, clergy, and officials either ignored or rationalized patterns of disappearance. Silence was not incidental. It was a weapon, an enabler, and a component of systemic control. Without it, the machinery would falter. The real horror is not the vanished children, but the system itself. Fear, obedience, and identity manipulation created a self-perpetuating mechanism, one that transcended the orphanage and left patterns etched into survivors' minds. St. Marguerite demonstrates the hidden architecture of control, showing how power can be exercised invisibly, subtly, and psychologically, shaping lives long after the apparent horror has ended. By now, the orphanage's deeper purpose becomes unmistakable. St. Marguerite was never about care or charity. It was about shaping human behavior, molding minds, and controlling perception. Each full moon, each disappearance, each carefully orchestrated ritual was part of a system designed to internalize fear, normalize obedience, and fracture identity. The children were not just victims, they were instruments in an elaborate experiment in domination. The conditioning was subtle, almost invisible. Sensory manipulation, disorientation, and ritualized terror combined to create a reality in which compliance became instinctual. Even those who survived carried the imprint. Doubt, fear, and submission became second nature. Thornfield had discovered that the most effective chains are invisible, embedded in the psyche rather than the body. Staff members functioned as extensions of the system, reinforcing obedience through both rewards and punishments. Every gesture, every word, every glance was calculated to maintain the rhythm of control. Complicity became self-reinforcing. Those who maintained the system were rewarded with trust, authority, or avoidance of scrutiny, while any hint of empathy or rebellion was systematically suppressed. Outside, the world remained unaware. Neighbors, officials, and clergy saw only the surface, charitable acts, the illusion of care, and the routine of daily life. But invisibility was Thornfield's greatest weapon. Control flourished precisely because it was unseen, subtle, and integrated into the structure of society itself. The lessons of St. Marguerite extend beyond history. The children who survived carried patterns of obedience and fear into the world, perpetuating a blueprint of influence that endures. The orphanage shows us the mechanisms by which institutions, through subtlety, ritual, and psychological manipulation, can dominate minds without visible force. This is the true architecture of control, invisible, systemic, and devastatingly effective. By this point, it is essential to recognize that the disappearances at St. Marguerite were not random. They were deliberate acts within a larger system of control. Thornfield and his council were testing, observing, and refining methods to fracture identity, instill fear, and mold compliance. Each child taken served a dual purpose, a subject of experimentation and a warning to those who remained. The full moon was the signal, the timing device that synchronized the ritual with psychological conditioning. Within the hidden chambers, sensory manipulation and ritual were deployed with surgical precision. Shadows, sound, and touch were instruments of control. Identity was deconstructed and reassembled according to Thornfield's design, creating minds attuned to obedience and internalized fear. Survivors emerged with fractured memories, shifting perceptions, and a pliability that ensured their utility to the system. Staff and collaborators enforced these patterns knowingly or unknowingly. Punishments were calibrated, rewards strategically applied, and behaviors meticulously observed. Every interaction reinforced submission, making the children both instruments and victims of a system that extended beyond the physical walls of the orphanage. Complicity became internalized. The rules were so embedded that enforcement required minimal oversight. Outside observers remained blind, either by choice or ignorance. The facade of charity, civility, and social responsibility obscured the reality within. Silence was essential. It perpetuated control, protected the system, and allowed the machinery of influence to function uninterrupted. The outside world became a shield, unintentionally enabling the orchestration of terror. The lesson here is profound. St. Marguerite demonstrates the mechanics of invisible power. Fear, obedience, and manipulation were not ends in themselves. They were tools, instruments of influence that ensured the continuation of control beyond the orphanage. Understanding this is key to recognizing how invisible systems of domination operate in broader society. As the years progressed, the orphanage became less a place of children and more a laboratory of control. Those who survived the cycles of disappearance carried deep psychological imprints, fear that had become instinct, obedience that required no external enforcement, and identity reshaped by ritual and manipulation. Each full moon acted as a reminder of the rules, a pulse reinforcing the internalized system. Thornfield's brilliance was in the subtlety. Fear was calibrated, obedience measured, and compliance internalized. The children learned to monitor themselves, correcting behavior before punishment could occur. The staff, trained or coerced, reinforced these patterns, ensuring that control remained seamless, invisible, and self-sustaining. Deviations were eliminated quietly, silently, and without spectacle, creating a system that functioned even in the absence of direct supervision. The architecture of the orphanage itself amplified these effects. Corridors, hidden chambers, and disorienting layouts shaped perception and enforced submission. Even the outdoor spaces were designed to manipulate. Courtyards, shadows, and moonlight acted as psychological triggers, ensuring that fear and obedience were encoded into every experience. The environment itself became a teacher of the rules. Outside, the world continued to see charity and care, blind to the hidden architecture of terror. Clergy, officials, and neighbors either rationalized patterns of disappearance or ignored them altogether. Silence was not passive. It was essential. It allowed the machinery to operate, unchecked, invisible, and devastatingly effective. St. Marguerite's legacy is not simply in its horrors, but in the demonstration of power that is systemic, psychological, and invisible. The children were not just victims. They were instruments in a blueprint for control that could extend far beyond the walls of the orphanage. Understanding this is key. Influence is most effective when unseen, subtle, and internalized. By now, the orphanage's hidden mechanisms reveal a terrifying truth. St. Marguerite was a crucible for the human psyche, not a sanctuary for children. Every full moon, every disappearance, every ritual reinforced lessons in fear, compliance, and identity manipulation. Thornfield had discovered that the mind is the most potent instrument of control, and he wielded it with surgical precision. The children who survived carried internalized patterns of obedience, fear, and self-policing. Resistance was unthinkable. Deviation was punished through absence, erasure, and psychological reinforcement. Their very perception of reality was shaped to align with the hidden rules of the orphanage, leaving them conditioned to maintain the system even when removed from its walls. Staff and collaborators acted as extensions of Thornfield's will, enforcing the system through subtle calibration of punishment and reward. Every gesture, every glance, every command was part of a deliberate strategy to reinforce obedience and perpetuate control. Complicity became ingrained. Those who upheld the system ensured their own protection, creating a self-sustaining network of influence and fear. The town remained blind. Neighbors, clergy, and officials continued to perceive the orphanage as charitable, benevolent, and ordinary. Yet the invisibility of the system was its greatest weapon. Power thrived precisely because it operated in silence, in subtlety, in ways the human eye could not perceive. Fear and obedience became internalized, encoded into the minds of the children like an invisible chain. The lesson of Saint Marguerite is clear and chilling. The most effective control is not physical but psychological and systemic. The orphanage's vanished children were instruments in a blueprint for domination that transcended walls, time, and memory. Understanding this is not just historical, it is a lesson in recognizing the hidden architecture of power and influence that shapes minds and society to this day. By this point, it becomes undeniable. Saint Marguerite was a masterclass in invisible power. The orphanage operated not through overt force, but through the subtle orchestration of fear, obedience, and psychological manipulation. Each child who survived carried within them lessons embedded so deeply that resistance became nearly impossible. Identity itself was reshaped, fractured, and reconstructed according to Thornfield's hidden agenda. The full moon acted as both a ritual and a mechanism of conditioning. It synchronized disappearances, reinforced fear, and activated the cycles of psychological control that governed the children's lives. Those taken were erased from the surface world, but their absence served as a lesson, a reminder to the survivors that the rules of submission were absolute and non-negotiable. Staff and collaborators, whether coerced or willing, functioned as extensions of this system. Their presence ensured the seamless execution of Thornfield's methods, reinforcing patterns of compliance while maintaining the illusion of benevolence. Even minor actions, gestures, glances, tones of voice, were calibrated to shape perception and behavior. The orphanage was alive, a self-sustaining ecosystem of control. Outside, society remained oblivious. Clergy, officials, and neighbors either rationalized the patterns of disappearance or ignored them entirely. Silence was not accidental, it was essential. The effectiveness of Thornfield's design relied on invisibility, on the subtle encoding of obedience and fear, and on the social complicity that enabled its continuation. The legacy of Saint Marguerite extends far beyond the physical structure. Its blueprint, fear, ritual, manipulation, and control, demonstrates how power can operate invisibly, shaping minds and behaviors without overt enforcement. The children were not merely victims, they were instruments in a system designed to perpetuate itself, leaving traces of influence that echoed into the wider world. By now, the true scope of Thornfield's operation becomes chillingly clear. Saint Marguerite was not just an orphanage, it was a laboratory for the study and control of human obedience. Each cycle of the full moon was both a signal and a mechanism, orchestrating disappearances, reinforcing fear, and embedding the rules of compliance into the children's minds. Survival required submission, and submission became instinct. The rituals, sounds, shadows, and spatial manipulations fractured identity. Every child who remained internalized the lessons. Trust was dangerous, autonomy was a threat, and obedience was survival. Even those who survived the horrors carried patterns of behavior conditioned to reinforce the system, self-policing, vigilant, and compliant, trained to perpetuate the invisible architecture of control. Staff acted as silent enforcers. Each word, gesture, and action was calculated to maintain the rhythm of fear and obedience. Deviations were eliminated quietly, without spectacle, ensuring the integrity of the system. Complicity became a self-reinforcing loop. Those who participated preserved their safety and status, further embedding the mechanisms of influence. Outside, the world remained oblivious. Neighbors, officials, and clergy perceived only a charitable institution, masking the psychological engineering within. Silence, rationalization, and inattention ensured that Thornfield's system remained hidden, functional, and devastatingly effective. Power thrived because it operated invisibly, shaping minds without chains, rituals without recognition. The lesson is unflinching. Saint Marguerite was a blueprint for systemic control, demonstrating how fear, manipulation, and ritual can be combined to dominate human behavior invisibly. The vanished children were never merely victims. They were instruments in a design that extends beyond walls, beyond time, and perception. To understand this is to glimpse the architecture of influence that operates quietly in the world today. As the orphanage's shadow deepens, one begins to see the precision of its orchestration. Thornfield's design relied not on chaos but on meticulously calculated cycles of fear and compliance. The full moon dictated rhythm, the hidden chambers dictated environment, and the staff dictated behavior. Every element reinforced obedience, ensuring that the children internalized the rules so deeply that resistance became instinctively impossible. The children who survived were transformed. Fear had become internalized. It no longer required external enforcement. Identity was fractured and reshaped, producing minds attuned to submission, self-monitoring, and silent compliance. Even the smallest deviation was corrected by subconscious reinforcement, a testament to the power of subtle systemic conditioning. The orphanage did not just punish, it reprogrammed. Staff acted as extensions of this system, enforcing patterns of obedience with both precision and discretion. Their gestures, tones, and actions were calibrated to maintain the rhythm of fear, ensuring the children remained within the invisible boundaries of control. Complicity was incentivized and deviation was quietly erased, maintaining the machinery without exposing its methods. Beyond the walls, society remained blind. Officials, clergy, and neighbors continued to perceive only charity and care. Silence, rationalization, and ignorance allowed Thornfield's design to function uninterrupted. The hidden architecture of influence thrived because it was invisible, systemic, and psychologically entrenched. Understand this: the horrors of Saint Marguerite are not merely historical curiosities, they are a blueprint for domination. Fear, ritual, and psychological manipulation created a self-sustaining system, leaving traces that extend far beyond the orphanage. The vanished children were not only victims, they were instruments, or if an invisible power, a lesson in how influence can shape minds, identities, and ultimately, society itself. By this point, the full magnitude of Saint Marguerite's influence becomes undeniable. The orphanage was a laboratory in which human behavior was meticulously studied, manipulated, and controlled. Each child was a living subject, each full moon a trigger for fear, obedience, and identity fracturing. Survival was not just about physical endurance, it required mental submission, the internalization of rules so deeply that even absent supervision, compliance persisted. Thornfield's methods were subtle, precise, and horrifyingly effective. Shadows, sounds, spatial disorientation, and ritualized terror combined to fracture the self and reshape perception. Children learned to police themselves, to anticipate punishment, and to obey instinctively. Resistance became nearly impossible, not because of chains or locks, but because the mind itself had been conditioned to enforce the rules. Staff members acted as extensions of this invisible machinery. Every gesture, glance, or word reinforced fear and obedience. Deviations were silently corrected, compliance was reinforced through subtle rewards. The orphanage operated as a living organism, with each participant, child or adult, functioning as a cell within a larger system of control. Outside, society remained blind. Clergy, officials, and neighbors continued to see charity and benevolence, masking the reality of the hidden architecture of influence within. Silence, rationalization, and social compliance ensured that Thornfield's design operated uninterrupted. The true power of Saint Marguerite lay in its invisibility, in the psychological control that extended far beyond its walls. This is the lesson Saint Marguerite imparts. Fear, ritual, and manipulation create self-sustaining systems of power. The vanished children were instruments in a blueprint for domination, a demonstration of how influence, once internalized, can extend beyond the physical confines of its origin. Understanding this is to recognize the hidden forces that shape behavior and society in ways few ever perceive. By now you must understand, Saint Marguerite's power was not in spectacle or violence, but in subtlety and invisibility. The orphanage functioned as a system of psychological engineering, where fear, ritual, and environmental manipulation created obedience without chains. The children internalized control, learned to monitor themselves, and became vessels of a hidden agenda that extended far beyond the orphanage walls. The full moon remained the key, the rhythm of the system. Each cycle triggered disappearances, reinforced terror, and activated the rituals that fractured identity and perception. Those who survived were conditioned to anticipate, submit, and perpetuate the lessons embedded in their minds. Resistance became not just dangerous, it became almost unthinkable. Staff and collaborators acted as extensions of this invisible machinery. Every punishment, reward, and interaction was calculated to reinforce compliance. Even subtle gestures, the tilt of a head, the tone of a voice, the timing of an instruction, were part of a meticulously orchestrated system. Complicity became a self-reinforcing mechanism. Those who participated ensured the system's survival and their own safety. Outside observers remained blind. Clergy, neighbors, and officials saw charity, care, and civility, never the architecture of fear and control that thrived beneath. Silence, rationalization, and ignorance maintained the system's invisibility. The orphanage's true power depended not on visible authority, but on shaping minds so profoundly that obedience became instinctual. The lesson is stark. The vanished children were not mere victims, they were instruments in a self-sustaining blueprint of domination. Fear, ritual, and psychological manipulation combined to create invisible chains that extended beyond the walls of Saint Marguerite, echoing into society itself. To grasp this is to see the architecture of hidden influence in its most refined, terrifying form. At this stage, the magnitude of Thornfield's orchestration becomes undeniable. Saint Marguerite was not simply an orphanage, it was a crucible of control, a laboratory where human obedience was studied, measured, and perfected. Every full moon acted as a mechanism, synchronizing disappearances, reinforcing fear, and embedding rules into the very fabric of the children's minds. Survival required submission, and submission became instinct. The rituals, shadows, and spatial disorientation fractured identity with precision. Children learned to monitor themselves, anticipating punishment before it arrived. Obedience was no longer enforced externally. It had become internalized, encoded into their perceptions, reactions, and choices. Resistance became almost impossible, as the mind itself became an instrument of control. Staff members were agents of the system, ensuring continuity and precision. Every gesture, glance, and word reinforced the rhythm of fear, shaping behavior in subtle yet profound ways. Complicity ensured protection and status, while deviation was silently corrected. The orphanage operated as a self-sustaining organism, its power invisible yet absolute. Outside, society remained blind. Clergy, officials, and neighbors continued to perceive only charity, masking the reality of the psychological architecture within. Silence, rationalization, and inattention allowed the system to function uninterrupted, proving that the most effective power is invisible, systemic, and internalized. Now, remember this. The vanished children were not mere victims. They were instruments of a blueprint for domination, a lesson in how fear, ritual, and psychological manipulation can perpetuate control far beyond physical walls. Understanding Saint Marguerite is to understand the hidden architecture of influence, the mechanisms by which minds, and ultimately society, can be shaped without overt force. This is where the full truth of Saint Marguerite crystallizes. The orphanage was never about charity, safety, or care. It was about control. Every vanished child, every ritual, every full moon was part of a system designed to fracture identity, instill fear, and mold obedience. Thornfield created a self-perpetuating mechanism, one that functioned invisibly, silently, and with devastating effectiveness. The survivors carried lessons embedded deep within their psyches. Fear became instinct, compliance became second nature, and resistance became almost impossible. They internalized the rules, monitored themselves, and in many cases became unwitting perpetuators of the system. The true power of Saint Marguerite was not in its walls, locks, or punishments. It was in its ability to shape the human mind, creating instruments of control from those who were once innocent children. Staff and collaborators acted as extensions of this hidden machinery, ensuring that every nuance of behavior reinforced the architecture of obedience. Gestures, glances, words, all meticulously calibrated to maintain the invisible system. Silence, rationalization, and social complicity allowed Thornfield's blueprint to function beyond scrutiny, extending the orphanage's influence far past its immediate walls. Now here is where you, the viewer, must act. If you understand the architecture of control, if you recognize how invisible systems shape minds and societies, write this phrase twice in the comments. I see the hidden chains. By doing so, you mark your awareness and anchor the lessons that the orphanage's history imparts. Saint Marguerite leaves a legacy that is both chilling and instructive. It teaches that fear, ritual, and subtle manipulation can produce obedience without visible enforcement. The vanished children were instruments in a blueprint of domination, a demonstration of power exercised invisibly. To comprehend this is to glimpse the architecture of influence, the mechanisms of control, and the hidden forces that continue to shape the world today. Your descent into this forbidden knowledge is complete, but remember, understanding it changes you. Once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. The orphanage was only the beginning.